It's perfect.
Looks good. And it is 12:01, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Everyone, welcome back to UW Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. My name is James Wykowski, and I'm one of the internal medicine chief residents. Today is one of our endowed lectures, the Kirby Lecture, and so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Wald, who will do our further introductions today. Dr. Wald is the head of the Division of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and she'll tell us more about our speaker today.
Thank you so much. Well, first I wanted to tell you about Dr. Kirby, for whom this professorship and this lecture is named. Dr. Kirby was one of the founders of the Department of Medicine at University of Washington and the first infectious disease specialist in the Pacific Northwest. His work focused on antibiotics, and he developed standardized procedures for testing antibiotic susceptibility. So when you hear people talk about Kirby-Bauer plates, they were actually first invented by Doctors Kirby, Bauer, and Turk here at University of Washington. And that is still the primary way in which we as a community, as well as the FDA, assess the efficacy and clinical utility of antibiotics. Can I have the next slide? In his memory, his family established a visiting professorship in infectious diseases, which we have annually, except we stopped for COVID. And we look for people who exhibit intellectual curiosity, scientific excellence and achievement, superb clinical and teaching skills, and national leadership. So on the next slide, you can see the list of Kirby visiting professors since the inception of this program. And as you can see here, this year we have Dr. Carlos Del Rio, who is the current IDSA president, which is our national organization. But you can see here how many of the people that we have hosted have had the honor of being the national president of IDSA. So let me now introduce our speaker, who actually graced us with his presence here and gave us a wonderful talk on leadership when he was here last week, and the Grand Round was scheduled via Zoom for this week. So Dr. Del Rio is a distinguished professor of medicine at Emory University School of Medicine and professor of global health and epidemiology at the Emory's Rollins School of Public Health. He's the co-director of the Emory CFAR and the co-PI of the Emory CDC HIV Vaccine Trials Unit and the Emory VTEU, Vaccine and Treatment Evaluation Unit. Dr. Del Rio is also the International Secretary of the National Institute of Medicine. And as I mentioned, as of this October, he's also the president of the Infectious Diseases Society of America. So welcome, Carlos. Thank you for being able to join us.
Thank you, Anna. And I just want to say how honored I am to be invited as the Kirby visiting professor, but also how much I enjoyed my visit to you and to the division. You have incredible fellows and wonderful faculty, and it was just great to spend time with them and to really, hear what they're doing and the work that is being done. And I appreciate you giving me that book that was written about why Seattle became, the center for infectious disease research for the world, because in fact, Seattle has been, and it continues to be, one of the meccas of infectious disease research globally. So for many of us in ID, it is the place where a lot of the things are happening, continue to happen. And this is way before there was a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many other things. It was really through the work of people like Dr. Kirby and others at University of Washington that really the race of Larry Corey, King Holmes, and I could go on and on. Bob Petersdorf, that really turned University of Washington into the mecca of infectious disease that it is. For Grand Rounds today, I wanted to talk about crisis communication in the age of social media, and I wanted to talk about lessons from SARS, from influenza, Ebola, and now COVID-19. These are my disclosures as far as commercial disclosures, and I am scientific advisor for Resverlogics, which is developing drugs for COVID, and also have been advising Roche Diagnostics as they develop diagnostic tests for STDs, including monkeypox. But my bigger disclosure actually has to do with this pandemic. And then throughout this pandemic, I have had the privilege of advising the mayors of the cities of Atlanta, Savannah, and Phoenix, academic organizations like my own, but also the University of Miami, and also businesses and other organizations such as Delta, United, the U.S. Open, the NCAA, et cetera. So I've learned a lot about sort of how do organizations dealt with this, how businesses dealt with this pandemic, and how better work with them. And I think one thing that became very clear working with them is that one mistake that we made in communication is to tell people, well, it was either public health or the economy. And we created this false dichotomy between this public health versus the economy without really stating, in order to have a strong economy, you have to have a well-funded public health. So even that was a major mistake in communications we made from the very beginning. So people frequently ask me, how did I learn crisis communication? Well, I learned it back in 1994 when I was in Mexico as director of the National AIDS program there. And we had a major economic downturn. The peso value was cut in half, inflation soared, a severe recession. I had to really deal with how to manage a national program with half the resources and staff that had lost their jobs, et cetera. But the second and most important lesson was when the hospital that I work at, Grady Memorial Hospital, which is similar to Harborview, had an economic crisis, a major crisis in 2007, in which the hospital had a $60 million deficit. I could barely meet payroll. It was long overdue with major upgrades. And it was concerns that a major safety net hospital could close. And the dean of my medical school, Dr. Tom Lawley, said, look, you're going to have a lot of interviews about this in CNN and in other media, and you need to know how to communicate with the media. And he really sent me for 2 days of intensive media training on crisis communication that I think proved incredibly valuable. And one thing that I learned is that we as clinicians don't get this training, and it's very important that we learn how to communicate to the media, but more importantly, how to communicate during crisis. So you've seen this, that in any crisis it's an opportunity, and I always think about this, about how do we use crisis as a way to think about opportunities. Now I want to distinguish two types of crisis communication. One is risk communication, one is crisis communication. And risk communication is what we deal frequently, right? We deal with what might happen. We tend to tell patients, we do this very well. We tell patients all the time, what's your risk of, if you continue to smoke, you may get a heart attack. If you, continue not exercising, you will have more likelihood of having diabetes. So we're very good at dealing with risk communication, but we're not that good at dealing with crisis communication. And crisis is really dealing with what just happened, or is about to happen, or is still happening. And one of the things that you learn when you're dealing with infectious diseases is that infectious diseases lead to irrational behavior. Whether we think about HIV, SARS, pandemic influenza, Ebola, Zika, and now COVID-19, you see a lot of what we think it's irrational behavior in the population. And frequently we say, well, if we just gave the data, we just gave them the facts, they will behave rationally. And we tend to forget that it is subconsciously that people are behaving irrationally to infectious disease. And this has happened over and over, and we don't seem to learn this lesson. So one important characteristic of public health infectious disease crisis is that surprises happen. Pathogens and people behave in unexpected ways. I mean, we were all very happy when we said, you've been vaccinated, you can take your mask off, and then Delta came in, and no longer that was the case. The virus changed and things happen in a different way. People behave in unexpected ways. The outbreak that we saw on monkeypox in great part was related to sexual behavior and things that we didn't quite understand. This big sexual rage parties and other things. Things go wrong, and they continue to go wrong all the time. And the policies have to be changed in real time. Throughout infectious disease crisis, there's always going to be some flailing. And it is critical that we understand that officials tend to think it's important to hide the flailing. So you have somebody from CDC or from the government try to minimize the problems. And the reality is that there's going to be problems, and you have to talk about them openly. Think about, for example, the way in which CDC dealt with the fiasco with testing for COVID. They didn't deal with it from the very beginning in the right way, and that lost a lot of their credibility. So it's not about protecting your reputation. It's really about doing the right thing. And I think it's important that you learn as you go. You make mistakes, you cope the best you can with uncertainty, and you do what's best at the time you're handling it. So a critical component to crisis communication, and this is the link to the talk I gave to the ID division last week, is leadership. And there is, crisis communication, it depends on very good leadership. So there's a leadership approach to crisis, and a leadership approach, and crisis leadership is really one in which a leader has the ability to scan and see possibilities, the ability to learn and adapt, the ability to build trust across stakeholders, and the ability to seize opportunity and to be resilient. And I think throughout the COVID crisis, almost every day I will sit in my office and think about, okay, what were the possibilities I was missing? How did I need to learn and to adapt? How did I build trust and across stakeholders? Who were the people I didn't ever interact with that I now needed to interact with? And how do you seize the opportunities, and how do you, are resilient in this process? So some of the leaders that I've learned the most are actually some of the public health leaders that I've learned the most about crisis communication. I'm going to talk to them about them a little bit. And one of them is Jeff Copeland, who was director of CDC during the 2001 anthrax attacks. And Jeff said, "We will learn things in the coming weeks that we wish we had known when we started." And I think that's so important. You're going to make a recommendation today based on what you know today, but you're going to know something different tomorrow. And you will change your communication, and you need to be very clear about that, because otherwise people are going to say, well, you told us not to use masks. Now you tell us to wear masks. You were lying to us before. You weren't lying. You were just telling us based on what you knew, what needed to be done. I think the master of crisis communication in my mind is Rich Besser, who was CDC director during the 2009 pandemic flu, and who then went on to be the medical correspondent for ABC News, and now is the president of the RWJ Foundation. And Rich will say this that I thought was very important. It says, "I want to acknowledge the importance of uncertainty. At the early stages of an outbreak, there's much uncertainty, and probably more than everyone would like. Our guidelines and our advice are likely to be interim and fluid, subject to change as we learn more." Such a clear way of saying, we're going to make it as we go. And in fact, because he was such a great communicator, Nature, the journal Nature, in January of 2010, published this article, The Crisis Communicator, and said, how Rich Besser had really been the person that shaped the response to the pandemic in a really effective way. And Rich in this article says, the goal was to tell everything we know and everything we didn't know. Think about how important that is. The goal is to tell what we know and what we don't know. And finally is David Hinman. David Hinman was at WHO during the 2002-2003 SARS pandemic. And David Hinman said, we will build our boat and sailing at the same time. So a crisis is when it's most important for a leader to uphold a vital aspect of the role of leadership is to make a positive difference in people's lives. And doing that requires leaders to acknowledge that personal and professional challenges the employees are having and their loved ones are having during a crisis. So it's really important that you as a leader recognize that during COVID, people were getting infected, family members were getting sick, people were having crisis at their home, and you have to acknowledge that, and you have to require you to take care of that in addition to taking care of the crisis. Otherwise, you're not going to have the respect of people that work for you. So what are the most useful weapons that we have at our disposal to attack fear in crisis? And there are three: transparency, truth, and constant communication. So let's talk about transparency first. Transparency is the job number one for leaders during a crisis. You have to be clear what you know, what you don't know, and what you're doing to learn more about it. And again, Rich Besser said it very well, right? We never heard anybody during COVID, whether it was Anthony Fauci or CDC director, or anybody at that point, say, okay, this is what we know today. This is the things we don't know, and this is what we're doing to find out more about that. A very thoughtful, frequent communication shows that leaders are following the situation and adjusting the response accordingly. We did see that. We did see frequent communication. But leaders should take special care to see that each audience concerns, questions, and interests are addressed. And we didn't do that very effectively. And finally, it's very important that having members of the crisis response team speak firsthand about what they are doing is particularly effective. And we didn't see that. It would have been so easy to, for the CDC director to say, hey, let's have Dr. X of who's working on this topic present to us right now. Let's have Dr. Y presenting us right now. So it's really important that you go to your technical people and get them in front of the camera and get them to explain what they're doing. Obviously not in technical terms. You have to train them for that. But it's very important that you get people that are working with you to talk about it. And again, we all have a strategy. We worked on having a pandemic influenza strategy as a country. We did desktop exercises. But the reality is when the time came, once the outbreak happened, then our strategy goes to hell, right? And everybody has a strategy until they're punched in the mouth. And that's exactly right. The strategy disappears the moment you have a crisis. So in crisis communication, I tell people that the most important thing is a combination of confident tone with tentative content. You have to talk as if you know what you're doing. You have to talk with confidence, but your content has to be tentative. You have to say, this is what we don't know. This is the things we're trying to find out. We need more information on X, Y, and Z. Because the reality is you don't know what's going to happen next. You may have to change a bunch of policies after you see what works and what doesn't. And they're going to be screw-ups, so you have to have that tentative content. And coping with chaos and uncertainty goes with the job of being a leader. So you better get used to it. And the most important thing is don't freak out. Even when things are really bad, your role as a leader is not to freak out. So what are the things that it's important that people do during crisis communication? Well, Bernstein has written a lot about this and says there are 5 tenets. Number 1 is identify and get to know your communications team. I had no idea who the communications team was for Emory or for Grady. But once the crisis happened, the first thing I did is I get to know who they were, and I work very closely with them because you're going to have to work with the communications teams. You have to anticipate that things will go wrong. You have to establish a good communication system with your faculty, with your students, with your mentee, with everybody that works around you. You have to identify and know your stakeholders. And then you have to frequently develop statements. You have to develop position statements. You have to do town halls. You have to do whatever it takes to let people know what's going on. Now, what are the things you don't do? Well, again, Bernstein says the things you don't do is you don't play ostrich. You don't say, oh, this is no big deal. It's going to go away in a week. You only start working after the crisis is gone public. You don't say, well, my reputation is great. I'm going to do things right because I am CDC or I am the FDA. You never treat the media like your enemy. You don't get stuck in a reaction mode. You have to be proactive. You have to use language that the audience understands. Again, you listen to your stakeholders. You don't assume that truth will triumph overall. I mean, I think this is very important. We'll talk about, fake news and miscommunication later on. We frequently have said, oh, if we just tell the truth to people, they're going to understand. Well, that's not how things work, especially during a crisis. You never just address only issues and ignore feelings. You don't just make written statements. And you certainly don't do things over and over and expect different results. So CDC has taught for years a strategy called SOCO, Single Overriding Communication Objective. And the point here is they train you to stick to your key messages as much as possible. And when you're asked anything else, you bring it back to SOCO. So, you're talking about, today I'm going to be talking about masks and the efficacy of masks. And then a question comes from the media saying, well, do vaccines work? And you say, well, vaccines are useful, but let me bring you back about how masks continue to be useful or have a role to play. So SOCO is that way to bring back the message to what you're trying to talk about in that moment. Now, we're living in a digital age, and communication is very different. I remember during the 2009 pandemic influenza, talking to David Sencer. David Sencer had been the CDC director during the swine flu epidemic that led to a development of vaccine, and that vaccine led to an outbreak of Guillain-Barré. And I asked him, I said, David, how many press conferences did you have? And he said 4. The day we said there was an outbreak, the day we said we had a vaccine, the day we said, Guillain-Barré was caused by the vaccine and we were stopping vaccination, and the day I was fired from CDC. 4 press conferences throughout an outbreak. Now you do press conferences daily or twice daily. You're in the news all the time. So digital age has changed dramatically how we communicate. So there's several things that are important. Number one is you have to be prompt. Only rumor or innuendo will fill the gaps if you're not prompt. You have to be compassionate, and I think this is really important. If you don't deal with people's feelings first, they won't listen to you. And I think one of the things we've seen in Twitter is aggression and a lot of people screaming and shouting. Compassion is when you're going to get your message across. You have to be honest. You should not be lying because of commission, omission, or understatement or exaggeration. You have to be honest. You don't try to spin things. You have to be informative. You have to answer the basic journalistic interrogatives of who, what, when, why, where, and how. And then you have to be interactive. In this digital age, you have to provide multimedia responses. You have to do all sorts of things to respond to people. So in Infectious Disease Society of America, IDSA, with a bunch of colleagues, we put together this paper about how the field of infectious disease can leverage digital strategies and social media during a pandemic. And I think there are a lot of really important lessons here of what can be done to leverage social media effectively during a pandemic. So let's move on and talk about misinformation and public health. I think all of us dealt and continue to deal with misinformation. And in fact, Dr. Tedros, who's the Director General of WHO, says, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than the virus and is just as dangerous. And, this has been going on for a while. I mean, remember the pandemic started in December, 2019, January of 2020. By May of 2020, just a few months into the pandemic, WHO put this out. False information on COVID-19 is spreading and putting people in danger. So this early on, we started to deal with this information almost as we started to deal with the pandemic. Now, what's misinformation? Misinformation is information that is false, inaccurate, or misleading, according to the best available evidence at the time. Disinformation is misinformation spread intentionally to serve a malicious purpose, such as to trick people into believing something for financial gain or political advantage. Now, social media has had a tremendous impact on misinformation because the fake news travels faster than real news. The online polarization fosters misinformation spreading. Fake news and sophisticated disinformation campaigns are a growing problem. And an important advice to everyone is that before you share something, you need to ask yourself, who published this? Who's behind this? What are their intentions? Are they credible? And misinformation is about manipulation. Disinformation is about manipulation. And Sandra van Loden in Cambridge has said that this could be about impersonation, conspiracy, dealing with emotions, polarization, discrediting, or frank trolling. So as I said before, misinformation isn't a new phenomenon, but with the growth of the internet and social media, it has amplified and spreads faster than ever before. So what is the role that physicians and other healthcare providers have in the age of social media? Do we have a responsibility to fight against this new age pandemic that spreads more quickly than ever before? And social media is something that we're going to have with us for years. So we're going to have to get used to it, and we're going to have to know how to harness it to prevent misinformation. So where do people find health information today? Where nearly 3 out of 4 Americans search online for health and medical information, and 82% of the US population has a social network profile. However, very few social media platforms attempt to differentiate between credible and uncredible sources of health information, leaving consumers to make their own judgments. And misinformation can proliferate in part because we tend to surround ourselves with like-minded people online and in real life, creating an echo chamber that reflects and reinforces our own views and beliefs. And additionally, the social media algorithms serve up similar content based on what we previously searched, creating reinforcement loops of information or disinformation. So misinformation confuses by diluting the pool of legitimate information. Conspiracy theories work because they provide the comfort of the explanation in times of uncertainty. You have to ask yourself, who benefits from misinformation? Is there a financial gain? Is there political gain? And I'll give you an example of that. The anti-vaccine industry is an excellent example. It is wellness and nutritional supplement companies that are the major backers and who directly profit from anti-vaccine campaigns. Anti-vaccination content reaches up to 58 million online followers and is deliberatively retained by social media giants because there's a lot of money in advertising. There's some $1 billion in advertising from wellness and nutritional supplement companies that they benefit from, and they don't care if they're benefiting anti-vaccination campaigns. And we all know that hesitance against one campaign is quickly transposed into other vaccines, which causes enormous problems. And we're seeing those. So a lot of untruths are discussed in social media. And because of that, we have thought about how do you correct it? How do you do this? Is it easy? How do you do it? Well, the reality is that correcting misinformation is really hard. Now, there's been two initiatives that I think are worth mentioning. One is a Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who recently released his report confronting health information, sort of the US Surgeon General advisory on building a healthy information environment. And this report says, misinformation is often framed in a sensational emotional matter that can connect viscerally, distort memory, align with cognitive biases, and heighten psychological responses such as anxiety. People can feel a sense of urgency to react to and share emotionally charged misinformation with others, enabling it to quickly spread and go viral. So how misinformation is framed is critically important in then spreading. At the National Academy of Medicine, we have been working also with social media platforms, most importantly with Google and YouTube, to really create a way to identify credible sources of health information. And a lot of the work that has been done is now being put in place by Google, by YouTube, to really say, this is credible information, this is not credible information. So in the National Academy Working Group, it was concluded that trustworthy sources share science-based information without financial incentives and with transparency about where they came from. And credible sources of health information should meet three fundamental principles. They should provide information that is consistent with the best scientific evidence available at the time. They should be objective, and they should be transparent and accountable. So what are the lessons that I've learned in crisis communication? Well, I think the first one is that damaging information presence in the internet spreads virally. And with rare exceptions, media interview skills are not part of what we physicians or PhDs learn. The ability to make a flawless presentation at a conference is not necessarily something that translates on the ability to present on camera to the media. And when you're to be an effective spokesperson in a crisis, you must come across as compassionate, as confident, and as competent. And sometimes when you get in a fight with somebody, it's wiser to make peace than to be right. Avoid getting into sprats with powerful organizations such as government agencies or the media. And any significant decision has a public relations impact, internally or externally, and you need to be aware of that. If you make a decision, it's going to have an impact. So I want to mention to you that we recently published in Nature this paper on a consensus statement with very clear messages on what to do with how to end the epidemic and what was needed. And one of the most important things we talked about is the importance of building trust. And we think that building trust is critical in order to end the pandemic, but more importantly, in order to have a robust public health going forward for future pandemics. So in conclusion, communication is a critical part of crisis response. I think it's really important that you do it in a positive framing. And I would say that the trust is the center of crisis communication. And I tell people that the most important thing for a good communicator is to be a rock. And that means that you're reliable, you're open, you're competent, and most importantly, you're kind. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Del Rio, for a really thoughtful presentation on an important topic that I don't think any of us get enough education on. Folks, we would love to hear your questions in the chat. Go ahead and put them in, and then I'll ask them to Dr. Del Rio as they come in. Yeah, I think the first question coming in, and you shared a little bit about sort of being sent to get focused training on this topic, but is there a place where folks who are seeking additional education can get that training?
I would say, the best place are your professional societies. Many professional societies have gone to understand that this is important. And I can say that, for example, through IDSA, we offer this kind of media training, but I bet you your institution does as well. But professional societies are a place that frequently you can go to, and they want to do this. They want to train you how to do this. And particularly nowadays, in this age that we clearly know that this is important.
I'm curious if you talked a lot about sort of a lot of examples of strong crisis communication and events that, from my memory, were sort of time limited, where there was sort of an acute crisis that lasted weeks to maybe months. And I'm curious if you think about this any differently in the type of scenario we're in now, where this has gone on for a number of years, and yet there's still a need for ongoing communication. Do your tactics change at all? Does your approach change at all?
I think it does. I think now we're more in sort of how do you communicate, sort of the chronic phase of the communication. I mean, I think about, when I talked about diseases and, I mean, you say time limited. Well, I've been doing communication on HIV. We were now 40 years into the HIV pandemic, right? And I still did several press conferences on World AIDS Day. My communication on World AIDS Day was very different than the communication on World AIDS Day 20 years ago, before we had, highly active antiretroviral therapy. So I think as things change, you have to change your communication. I'll give you an example. There are 2 MMWRs today talking about the vaccine efficacy of the bivalent boosters. And I was talking to an NPR reporter about it. And I said to that reporter that, initially we heard, at some point in time, the COVID pandemic is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Well, at this point in time, that's not true anymore. The COVID pandemic today, especially the people that are hospitalized and dying, is a disease primarily of the elderly, those over 65 or older. Many of them are not vaccinated or not boosted and have not received a booster. So the message has to be very different, right? To tell people, oh, if you're vaccinated, you're going to be fine, is the wrong message, because older individuals who haven't been boosted are still going to get sick and are still going to die if they don't get boosted. So we have to change our message. We have to say the current COVID pandemic primarily is impacting severely older individuals, and we got to get them boosted. So we change the message as we have better information.
That's great. And then there's a few questions sort of in the same vein about how many folks who have been really outspoken advocates for good scientific information, and many of the really public figures have been subjected to a lot of hate speech on the internet, threats, and in some cases death threats. And how, in your own experience, have you sort of dealt with that kind of pressure? And how do you think about other folks trying to respond to that kind of environment, and remain comfortable being an outspoken advocate?
It's really tough. I have personally had significant threats throughout this period. People, there was a point that I would say something and I could almost sit by my computer and expected to get all sorts of insults and threats and other things. And it's really hard. I mean, it's really, really hard to deal with it. You have to develop a very thick skin. You also have to when they get very serious. I mean, when I had personal threats that were dealing with that clearly weren't to violence. I mean, threats, messages and calls saying, we know where you live, we know how you call the police. At that point in time, you have to call people that are experts in security and talk to them and see what they have to say. So there's a way to deal with it, but I think it's very sad that we've gone that way. And it's a product of what we're seeing in our times, right? I mean, we're at a times that that political aggression and the political discourse has gotten incredibly aggressive. You know, I think we should learn how to disagree, but not necessarily be disagreeable. And I think that has changed dramatically in how we deal with things. People think that, you know, the one that screams louder has more points, and we have to change that. But the threats component have been particularly bad, and I think it's, you know, I would say that for people that have had serious threats, like Dr. Fauci, has been incredibly disheartening, because I don't think he ever expected that to be the case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Another question sort of on a bit of a different topic that I'll note is not from one of our ID faculty, but from one of the other divisions. I'm thinking about you've recently been also speaking a bit on the importance of a pipeline for physicians going into infectious disease. And I think this is certainly a hot topic with the recent fellowship match numbers. And was curious to hear sort of your thoughts on what we can do to improve this crisis, knowing how important ID doctors are to all of our work.
Well, you know, part of what you said right now, I think, plays a role, right? If you have, I mean, we know there's several factors. There's not one factor. One of those factors, without doubt, is the burden of debt that people in ID and people, you know, finishing medical school have. And unless we fix that, we're going to continue to have problems. So I think we need to start by fixing the debt people have from medical school as one of the important things we have to do. But in addition to that, you know, I think, you know, we in IDSA have been working hard on improving the compensation for infectious disease physicians. I think we also have to make it very clear that we get in front of our residents and our students and we tell them what we do in ID. I think that, you know, unfortunately, as I see things over time, and I was talking to Paul about this when I was in Seattle, you know, when I came to Emory many years ago, I used to do, you know, 4 or 5 months of medicine, and many in ID did. So we tended to round with the medicine residents, and they tend to see us. Now, almost all the medicine rounds are being done by hospitals with general medicine, and ID is done, so the residents don't get exposed to what we do. And then the rotation of the residents is even smaller. So I think there's a lot of issues that we need to address, right? We need to increase the exposure. We need to tell them, show them what we do, and we need to make sure that they don't think that there was a resident interested in ID who was talking to me and said, you know, before I rounded with you, I felt like ID was just the no police. The people that came around told us not to use this antibiotic or that antibiotic. And he didn't truly get an understanding of what ID was until he started rounding with me. So I think we have to do many things. It's just not one simple thing. But I do think that, you know, the increasing burden of debt of people graduating from medical school is impeding people to go into specialties that are not as highly compensated, and ID is one of them. But same thing can be said about rheumatology, endocrinology, pediatrics, and I can go on and on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Del Rio, for joining us and sharing your expertise and experience in this field. Everyone, this is our last grand round for the 2022 calendar year. Hope everyone has a nice holiday break, and we'll look forward to seeing you back in January next year. Take care and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.